The following series is meant as pure fan fiction, and in no way does it share the views of anyone else or those involved in this story. We will start this episode with a quick recap of the year prior, 2001. Throughout the year, Kurt spent most of his free time in the UK hanging with friends, while Pj Harvey has been off doing her own thing with her band in support of their latest album. The two would inevitably begin fighting and arguing once it's established that Kurt has been taking pills and doing drugs. The arguments also escalate once Kurt realizes Harvey's ex-boyfriend was accompanying her on her tour. While being back and forth between his home outside of LA and Harvey's home in London, Kurt did some much-needed work to his home studio, which he had been renting out to producers and bands for the extra money. By the fall, the terrorist attacks in New York City changed the entire world. In this timeline, Kurt and Paul McCartney would witness it together, and the two begin planning a benefit concert for New York City that sees many legendary musical acts perform. In this timeline, however, Kurt gets in contact with Dave Grohl, and it is decided that Nirvana will reunite for one time only to play the show. For the following months, after the event, all three members of Nirvana would constantly state that Nirvana will never reunite again, and that it was a one-time only deal for a good cause. Although, by the end of the year, the three would meet up and jam old songs together at Kurt's place. This brings us to 2002. January 2002. We last left off with the three members of Nirvana getting together at Kurt's place for a jam session at the end of 2001. During that session, they performed a handful of songs together, including Drain You, Radio-Friendly Unit Shifter, In Bloom, and School, along with some old covers they used to play, including Best Friend's Girl by the Cars, as well as a new cover of The Boys Are Back in Town by Thin Lizzy, which was suggested by Dave, who showed Kurt the chord progressions and also helped with the vocals. It's clear that everyone was just having a great time. No new material was conceived during this session. Kurt has been spending a lot more time in his home outside of LA rather than being in the UK with Pj Harvey. His newfound love of jamming with the guys really took over his life, and that's all he feels like doing. Though he has been in contact with Harvey as well as some friends in the UK. Around this time, in the beginning of the year, Kurt catches wind of his unreleased songs from Christotomy being leaked online. He doesn't seem overly concerned about it and shrugs it off by saying, quote-unquote, "Yeah, of course that happened." He doesn't intend to find out how they got leaked. He does, however, officially close down his studio to outside producers and bands in the end of January 2002. February 2002. On February 4th, 2002, a meeting between Kurt and Courtney is made for Kurt to pick up his daughter and take her back to London to spend time with Pj Harvey. It's clear Harvey is against the idea of Kurt doing the meetings with Courtney himself. She simply doesn't like her and doesn't trust her. So Kurt offers to have her accompany him for the meeting. Kurt knew in his heart this was a bad idea, and more likely, nothing good will come from it. Bringing his ex-wife and his girlfriend together just spells bad news. But he felt obligated to show Harvey that there's nothing to worry about, and that he only meets with Courtney to make his daughter happy. All she wants is for both parents to have a civil relationship. On February 6th, Kurt and Polly arrive at the hotel Courtney has been staying. Upon arriving, Courtney sees Harvey, who she has no intentions on speaking to. They try to remain civil with each other. It wasn't until Frances gave PJ a big hug that Courtney starts to show her true colors. She tells Harvey that she's not and never will be Frances' mother, nor should she be acting like she is. A back and forth between Polly and Courtney ensues, with Kurt stuck directly in the middle. He just wants to get the hell out of there. PJ Harvey isn't mad at Kurt, but is upset that he didn't really stick up for her. He kind of just, quote unquote, let it happen. Frances intervenes and tells everyone to stop yelling at each other or she's not going to spend time with any of them. She says she will gladly go to her father's house outside of LA and stay there. She even mentioned going to stay with Dave Grohl for a bit, to which Courtney scoffs. It's clear she doesn't like Dave and isn't sure why Kurt would ever reconnect with him. She also states that the Nirvana reunion at Madison Square Garden was a farce, and that everyone involved is just lying to themselves that they can be relevant in today's world of music. She tells Kurt to his face that he should go off and enjoy his oldies act while he still can. Kurt, Polly, and Frances then leave and head back to Kurt's place. PJ Harvey is visibly upset about what transpired. On Kurt's birthday, he is joined at his house by Paul McCartney, Dave Grohl, Chris Novoselic, and PJ Harvey. They have a jam session, with Harvey sitting it out. She doesn't seem interested in being involved, and it's clear there is a lot on her mind. Dave and Chris, on the other hand, are absolutely ecstatic that Paul has joined in on their jams, serving as a second guitar player for the band, but also jamming some Beatles covers with the trio. Kurt would later say his 35th birthday was one of the best birthdays he's ever had. But it's clear to Kurt that Harvey is still deeply upset about what transpired with Courtney. She tells him she's not happy, whether it's constant lying about drugs, him not being easy to contact, or the drama with his ex-wife. She tells Kurt she needs a break and that she's going to fly out to the UK to go back home for a while, alone. This bothers Kurt and puts him into a depression. She elects to taxi out to the airport alone. Although Kurt offers to accompany her, she decides it's better if she goes alone, further creating more anxiety for Kurt. After she leaves, he takes 4 sleeping pills and passes out for 13 hours. It doesn't affect him like a regular drug overdose, but it does put him in a drowsy state for the next few days. March 2002. Cobain gives Harvey a call and says they should talk it out rather than avoid each other. After a half hour over the phone, Harvey agrees and Kurt makes a plan to fly out to her home in London, rather than hash it out over the phone. He does tell Harvey that he has to drop Frances off with Courtney yet again before he can fly, as she has no desire to leave the US at this point. PJ Harvey responds with quote-unquote, do whatever you want, putting Kurt in a bad mood, but he still goes through with his plan to fly out. On March 16th, Kurt arrives in London. Harvey doesn't meet him at the airport. Instead, he takes a taxi to her house. It's a 45-minute drive in dark, rainy weather. Kurt is left with an uneasy feeling, and he's nervous to meet with her after he heard her tone over the phone when she said, quote-unquote, do whatever you want. It's 11:30 p.m., and Kurt is visibly tired, and quite possibly on some form of medication. When he arrives at Harvey's house, the door is open, but she does not greet him. He walks in and immediately sits on the couch, about to pass out, when she finally walks in and confronts him. She offers him a tea, but he says no. She says he can stay the night and they will talk in the morning. They go to bed together for the night. The next morning, Harvey awakens, but Kurt does not. It's clear he's in some form of sleep coma yet again, and at this point, Harvey starts pulling the sheets off of Kurt and yelling to wake him up. She's pissed. She got him to come over so they could talk about the relationship, and he ended up doing some drugs before he went to sleep. This is seemingly the final straw for Harvey. When Kurt finally wakes up nearly an hour later, he notices some of his things are already packed, and it's clear to him what's going on. She's made up her mind with what she wants, and she tells him to finish packing his stuff and to go back home to his daughter and his ex-wife. Kurt and Polly's relationship ends much like Polly and Nick Cave's relationship ended in 1997 in our real timeline. Very quick and to the point. She's over it. And at first Kurt is heartbroken about it, but he chooses to not be visibly upset. He knew she was against his ways, and he has no intentions on changing for anyone. So he feels just as guilty as he claims she should feel about the whole thing. It's been 5 years with the two of them together. Only the first 4 seemed like it could become a long-term thing. Once the arguments and fights started, and with her calling out Kurt on every little thing he does, she was over it, and she wanted out. Kurt tells himself to give it time, but he knows in his heart that it's not going to work. So he quietly packs up his things and books a flight back to the US. He calls Paul and lets Paul know what's going on, with Paul assuring Kurt he will see him in the US soon, and they can resume rehearsals with the band. Kurt found it funny and kind of odd that Paul was referring to Nirvana as his band as well, but Kurt has never corrected him, so seemingly it's okay. Kurt arrives back home outside of LA on March 18th, 2002. At the end of March, Kurt starts jamming with Chris and Dave again, before Dave is set to start working on Foo Fighters' latest album. Kurt explains to the guys what happened between him and Harvey, and how he stayed the night before being unceremoniously ejected from the UK the next morning. Dave Grohl would make a comment stating, quote unquote, "Hey man, at least you got laid first." Kurt looks down at his feet and replies with a simple, "Yeah." But he shrugs it off as a joke. It's clear that Kurt is deeply hurt by what happened between the two. He cared for her very much and spent 5 years of his life with her. And now all of that is over. The band immediately start playing Teen Spirit, with Kurt having the dumbest smile on his face while playing the opening riff. Dave played so hard, Chris was certain the roof would cave in. Chris knew that Kurt was hurting, but he also knew having him and Dave around at this exact moment was meant to be, stating, quote unquote, "If Kurt didn't have these dumb little Nirvana jams, who knows what path he could go down after that breakup." April 2002. Dave Grohl begins the recording process of Foo Fighters' latest album, one by one. There have been some tensions within the band due to Taylor Hawkins' drug use, but the band is planning to go full steam ahead with the recording. Dave Grohl really missed just sitting back and playing the drums. He's a world-renowned rock star in his own right, and can go off and do whatever he wants and be successful. But a huge part of Dave misses being behind the drum kit. He also missed not having to worry about writing the songs and being the face of the band. As much as Dave loved it and loved being a famous rock star, sometimes it's just best to sit back and let someone else drive. So the jams with Nirvana have been great for him, almost therapeutic. The same goes for Kurt. He needs something in his life right now since the breakup of PJ Harvey, and being a close friend of Dave and Chris, they want the best for him. They want to keep him occupied so he doesn't go down another path that they can't follow. What Kurt isn't telling anybody is since the breakup with PJ Harvey, he has consciously thought about heroin. All through the 90s, the members of Nirvana have almost lost Kurt numerous times to overdoses and tensions within the band. This time, however, things are different. Kurt isn't on heroin, regardless of if he's thought about it or not. And he seems happy to just jam in a small room with the guys. It's fun for everyone. No album, no tours, no record deals. It's like being in a high school garage band all over again. They can do whatever they want together without any obligation. Later in April of 2002, Kurt wakes up to widespread news all over TV and the radio. This time, another tragedy has struck. Lane Staley has been found dead in his apartment of a heroin overdose. Kurt immediately calls his friends and mutual friends of him and Lane to share the news. Kurt regrets not trying harder to help Lane through his addiction struggles. He simply couldn't talk about heroin, and in turn, it made it so the last conversation he had with Lane was a quick one. He regrets not giving Lane one more call, even just to try and reach out and talk one last time. Kurt is deeply saddened by this passing and wishes there's more he could have done. May 2002. During the recording sessions of One by One, Foo Fighters' latest album, Taylor Hawkins suffers a heroin overdose and is left in a coma for almost 2 weeks. This happened in our real timeline as well. In light of the recent events within his band, Dave Grohl decides to halt all recording on his latest album. This also happens in our real timeline, although, at this time, Dave would have joined Queens of the Stone Age on their tour in 2002. In this timeline, Dave doesn't do that. Instead, he has Nirvana again. And Dave makes a suggestion for Nirvana to go out and start playing some small-time shows around town, just for something to do. Chris immediately agrees, and it takes Kurt some convincing. Kurt and Chris do agree that they also want to play some shows, but Kurt elects he will only do that as long as they perform as the opener for other small-time local bands that not many people have heard around town. He doesn't want to go out and be this big rock band headliner. He just wants to support local bands, hoping that having Nirvana's name on the bill will attract more audience for the smaller local bands. Dave and Chris agree, and in the following weeks they will begin jamming more and rehearsing some of their old hits, as well as working on some newer songs both Kurt and Dave have been working on in their own time. This time around, Kurt is more open to suggestions from other members of the band. They aren't on a big-time record label. There is no contract. It seems that it's a general consensus that all members of the band just want to have some fun and are tired of sitting around doing nothing all the time. Kurt isn't in the spotlight. The biggest rock star in the band now is Dave Grohl, as far as fans are concerned. Nirvana is as good as dead and hasn't been an actual band since 1996, with the release of Rohypnol. Most people truly believe the concert for New York in October of 2001 actually was a one-off, never to happen again. But it's clear to us now, seemingly Nirvana is alive and well, and shaking off the rust they have accumulated over the past 6 years. During one of the rehearsal sessions, Kurt asked Dave about song ideas and to give Kurt an idea for a really raw, greasy-sounding song, along the lines of something like Scentless Apprentice or Milk It. Dave shows Kurt an old Foo Fighters demo from 1994, a B-side to one of Foo Fighters' early hits. The song is Podunk. Upon hearing it, Kurt loves it. He says it's exactly what he wants to hear. So they start practicing it as Nirvana. The only thing Kurt wanted was to change the lyrics and the vocal melody to make it more personal to him. Kurt was known for singing whatever melody came to his mind after hearing a riff. So Dave will agree to this. Dave shows Kurt how to play the riff and immediately jumps behind the drums to play along. This is the first new Nirvana jam since 1996. In the end of May, Frances returns home to be with her father. Kurt receives a call from Courtney and they talk for over an hour. The contents of the conversation are not known, but it is clear Kurt is doing whatever he can to maintain the little bit of family he has left. He's still mad at Courtney for lashing out at him and PJ Harvey, but he doesn't blame Courtney for the inevitable breakup between himself and Harvey. He blames himself, and now he's trying to pick up whatever pieces of his life are left. The random Nirvana jams with Chris and Dave are helping, and seemingly to Kurt is the only thing he has at this moment. It's kept him from relapsing on heroin, and it's kept him from going over the deep end mentally. June 2002. Kurt and Dave start booking shows around LA, scheduling time in between to record some demos. Dave has a lot of pull in LA, and he's aware of a lot of the small-time local bands in the area. He starts making calls and pulling some strings to get Nirvana on some of these dive bar shows around town. It was an easy sell. The mere mention of Nirvana had promoters clamoring to have the band play at their venues. Kurt made it clear he didn't want to make any of these shows about him or the band. He would much rather open for the local bands, using the Nirvana name to put more eyes on the relatively unknown and unheard bands. Bringing Nirvana as a band back to its punk rock roots, and not being the headliner or playing in airplane hangars for that matter. Most of the venue capacity at these places can hold only about 200 people. That's music to Kurt's ears. That's what he wants. He knows that's what punk rock is all about. Even if it's 2002 and that kind of music isn't overly mainstream anymore. Kurt felt like it's the perfect time to get Nirvana back together, because now he can do it as a hobby. Considering Dave is a rock star in his own right, and he will soon be back into the studio with his own band, Foo Fighters. Kurt was starting to change his ideas of what Nirvana was, and could be. Before Nirvana broke up in 1996, it was his band, and it was his songs. But since that time Kurt went off and did his own projects, he had his own record company with Capitol Records in 1997. he had relevant in 1998, and in 2000 he released his own solo project, as polarizing as it may be. He started to realize what Nirvana means to him and gives credit to Dave Grohl, because without Dave Grohl's suggestion to reform the band for one night only in October of 2001, Nirvana still wouldn't be a thing, and Kurt feels like without Nirvana, he'd be doing heroin. Potentially, maybe even dead at this point. Nirvana booked 6 shows around LA for June of 2002 as the opening act for other local bands in town. The shows are a massive hit and put eyes on a lot of new upcoming bands nobody has heard of, hand-selected by Cobain himself. With having Nirvana's name on the bill, many fans initially thought it was a joke or some type of tribute band, but quickly realized it was the real thing. By the 5th and 6th show with Nirvana on the bill, the crowds got bigger and bigger, with a lot of fans having to be turned away at the door due to capacity limitations. This would make Kurt and Nirvana have to book more shows just so everyone could come and see the band. Kurt also noticed people leaving after they were done playing, as if they were only there to see Nirvana. After this realization, Kurt and Dave booked 3 more additional shows around town with the same bands they opened for, except now they choose to headline the show, just to make sure people stayed for the entire show, because they knew people would leave after they finished their set. Nirvana being back to playing shows again starts to make the headlines all over MTV and Much Music, with the general interest in the band beginning to rise again. Copies of Nevermind and In Utero are still selling very well, with Rohypnol and Bleach just behind them in sales. By late June, the small string of shows are completed. Dave goes back to the studio to finish his work on Foo Fighters' latest album, which is still intended to be released in 2002. Dave also plans on taking the band on a small 2-month US tour for the album, but he states that this won't affect what remains of Nirvana. All members of the band are currently in agreement with their current situation. Dave being gone gives Kurt time to tie up some loose ends at home and with his studio, as well as giving him time to work on new material to show Dave when he comes back from his recording. Chris will stay close by Kurt at this time, keeping him busy and showing interest in the ins and outs of recording and producing at a home studio. Kurt shows him some techniques on producing music. In Chris' eyes, this was just a way to keep Kurt, quote-unquote, out of trouble. But in the long run, it benefited both, as Chris will try his hand in producing some of Nirvana's new demos. Around this same time, Kurt Cobain writes Living the Lie while sitting at home with Frances. Chris would later come by later on and add a bass line which he described as, quote-unquote, absolute surf rock bass, something we've never done. With Dave's absence, all seems fine, but Kurt is silently struggling with thoughts of heroin. July 2002. Kurt and Chris spend much of the month working on some new material and fleshing out ideas. Whereas they agreed playing the old hit songs around town was fun, they wanted to start working on some new material. Chris mentions that the band should release a single, maybe an EP. Kurt shuts the idea down and states that he'd rather just play music and has no intentions on selling anything to anybody. Chris looks Kurt right in the eyes and says, quote-unquote, why the hell not? We're sitting here in a studio, we have all the gear, and you have a label. putting Nirvana's name on anything will pay out the ass. Kurt stops for a second and thinks about it, and he realizes Chris is probably right, but he doesn't tell him that, and they continue working on Living the Lie. Kurt named the song that because he feels like his entire life and his image in the public eye has all been a lie, and that he, more or less, faked his way into the spotlight. Although by this time in 2002, that spotlight has completely faded out of Kurt's life. And by this time, Dave Grohl is the biggest rock star out of all of the Nirvana members. On July 16th, 2002, Dave Grohl comes to Kurt's house to record drums for 3 demo tracks. Living the Lie being the first, along with Podunk and a new song that the band has been fleshing out called So Unsightly. This is the first real demo recording of the band since 1996. Later that day, the phone rings, and it's Paul McCartney on the other line, checking in on Kurt. During the conversation, Paul expresses to Kurt that he should split the cost with him to buy Nirvana's old catalog from Geffen Records. Kurt does seem interested in owning his own music, even if it would only be 50% of the cost. Kurt agrees to make plans to meet with Geffen executives along with Paul McCartney to see if they can strike a deal with the company to own Kurt's old Nirvana catalog on one condition. Kurt wants a 60-40 split in his favor, and as long as Paul doesn't, quote-unquote, Michael Jackson him. To those not aware, Michael Jackson bought the entire Beatles catalog for himself and gave no shares to Paul, who was in the midst of trying to buy the catalog himself. Paul agrees and says he still has a bad taste in his mouth from the acquisition. He states to Kurt, quote-unquote, that will never happen. I want to join Nirvana. They both laugh about it like it's a joke, but it seems clear Paul wasn't joking. Kurt is slightly annoyed that Paul keeps injecting himself into Nirvana at this time. By the end of July in 2002, Kurt and Chris have a solid list of new and old material to jam with. Unfortunately, at this time, Kurt begins taking a higher dosage of opiates, which starts to bring back some old memories of his heroin days. August 2002. The month starts off slow for Kurt, as he spends most of the time just smoking weed and editing demos. Chris Novoselic has been back and forth working on editing as well, but lately he's been spending more time at home, leaving Kurt by himself. Francis has been staying with Courtney, and on August 14th, Kurt received a call from Francis. During the call, Courtney ends up getting on the phone and talking to Kurt. The conversation starts off fine, with no issues. But as the conversation progresses, Kurt begins to lash out at Courtney and blaming her for the inevitable breakup with PJ Harvey a few months prior. Even though prior to this conversation, he only blamed himself. It's clear Kurt is under the influence of some type of drug or alcohol during this conversation. Courtney says it's Kurt's fault and that he has a horrible track record of keeping a relationship intact. She tells Kurt it was bound to happen eventually, and he can't blame her for his downfall. The argument continues, and Courtney says if Kurt keeps up with his bullshit, she's going to take him to court and reappeal the court's decision to give Kurt full custody of Francis. She makes it very clear she's not joking. Kurt doesn't let up and immediately hangs up the phone in an outrage. Kurt starts calling some old friends in Seattle, looking for drugs. None of them answer. Kurt gets a hold of Paul, who seemingly only wants to talk about himself or things that involve him, like purchasing Nirvana's song catalog. Paul seems disinterested in hearing about Kurt's life issues, but in Paul's defense, he was merely just trying to take Kurt's mind off everything. Although Kurt doesn't see it this way, and it changes how he feels about Paul. Kurt begins to start thinking about the bliss of his heroin use from years prior, but he fights the urge. By mid-August, Kurt is in another state of depression, refusing to take calls from any of his friends, including Paul McCartney and Chris Novoselic. With Dave Grohl's current absence from Nirvana while he's working on Foo Fighters' newest album, Dave sends a handful of pre-recorded drum tracks to Kurt and Chris to jam to until Dave returns to play drums in person. At this time, Kurt doesn't seem to care. He doesn't even open the emails, and he doesn't give a response to Dave or Chris, neglecting to contact anybody. For a moment, everything in Kurt's life seemed to be going great. But it's very evident that even a mere argument with his ex-wife can derail Kurt's entire life. That's all it takes. The Nirvana reunion seemed too good to be true to everyone involved, and now it's becoming more clear why. Kurt is not in a good state of mind, no matter how you look at it. Kurt effectively puts the Nirvana jams on hold at this time, essentially pulling the plug until further notice, without mentioning it to the other members. It definitely was too good to be true. On August 28th, 2002, Kurt gets into contact with Mark Lanegan for the first time since 1998. They ran into each other at a cafe in downtown LA. Mark was out with friends and Kurt was just wandering around town. At this time, the Nirvana reunion shows around LA are still the talk of the town. Kurt is well recognized in the streets, taking pictures with a few fans and even signing a handful of autographs on the street. Mark tells Kurt that Nirvana should come back to Seattle and play a handful of shows back home. Kurt states that he is unsure of the state of the band, as he just doesn't care too much about it at the moment. Kurt would tell Mark, quote unquote, "It was fun while it lasted. It served its purpose at the time I needed it. And now I'm unsure of what I want." Completely contradicting the way he felt about the band just a month prior. It's known that Nirvana does have a few unheard demos at this time from Cobain's home recording studio. Those tracks would include Living the Lie, Podunk, and So Unsightly, which have all been fully recorded back in July. Mark invited Kurt out to Seattle anyway to visit some old friends who haven't heard from him or seen him in quite some time. Kurt agrees and they make plans to meet up in September of 2002. Mark is still heavy into heroin at this time in 2002. In our real timeline, however, Mark Lanegan would kick heroin by the late 90s, with the help of Courtney Love after Kurt's death. With Kurt still being alive and Mark not having anything to do with Courtney after the divorce, that doesn't happen. And Mark is still using heroin. September 2002. In the beginning of the month, Kurt flies out to Seattle to visit Mark Lanegan. They haven't actually hung out since 1998. Kurt hasn't been in Seattle since October of 1999. Being in Seattle brings back a lot of uneasy memories and familiar faces. But it is and always will be home to him. He can't deny that. Kurt arrives at Mark's house on September 4th, 2002, where Mark offers him to stay the night. Kurt declines and chooses to stay at a motel. They talk about the band and the state of Kurt's music career, which he calls quote-unquote non-existent. Mark praises Kurt for the small-time shows Nirvana has been playing around LA in the last few months, stating that it's a pretty big deal to have the three members of Nirvana back in the saddle and doing favors for small-time local bands. Kurt responds with a simple, "Yeah." Kurt explains that he isn't sure what he wants to do, and that the breakup with PJ Harvey put him into a state of depression, and that he brought Nirvana back for that short period of time as a coping mechanism, and that he doesn't really overly care about the band or being in a band. He said it was fun while it lasted and doesn't care if it goes any further than it did. He's glad he was able to help get more eyes on small-time local bands around town. But that's pretty much all he feels good about. He tells Mark about Paul McCartney and how Paul is the reason Nirvana came back in the first place. But he also mentions he doesn't have as much respect for Paul as he did, as he feels Paul likes to inject himself and make everything about him. He does, however, appreciate everything Paul did for him in the time they spent together. He makes a joke and says, quote-unquote, "If only it was John Lennon instead." To which the two of them laugh. Mark mentions that they should call Michael Stipe and work out some ideas for a new Relevant album. Kurt says he will keep that idea in mind. As the night goes on, the two enjoy some drinks. Out of the blue, Kurt says he has a friend looking for some heroin, and he knows that Mark has it. Kurt says he's going to be the middleman for this supposed friend and collect the heroin for them, and he will bring it to them himself. Mark gives Kurt a very stern look and says, quote-unquote, "Kurt, you know I trust you, but it's been a long time since we've hung out. I don't think I can let you leave here with heroin in your pocket. I'm not going to be that guy." Kurt laughs and says, quote-unquote, "It's fine, man. I've been clean for years." Mark goes on to say that he doesn't agree with the fact that Kurt is enabling someone else to use by being a middleman. Kurt goes on about how it's not a big deal at all, and that he's really just trying to help out a friend. Mark declines to give Kurt any heroin. It's clear this decision bothered Kurt, and his demeanor changed from happy to see his friend to overall uninterested. After about a half hour, he says goodbye and he leaves, presumably to go to the motel. Kurt spends the rest of the night looking around town for heroin. He calls Dylan Carlson, but he does not answer. The next day, he flies back home outside of LA. When Kurt arrives home, he has several missed calls and a few messages from Dave and Chris, as well as Paul McCartney and Courtney. Kurt decides to not answer anyone's messages or return anyone's calls. Instead, he calls PJ Harvey. She doesn't answer, and he doesn't leave a message. By the end of September, Kurt has yet to respond to any of his friends, creating anxiety for his friends who have been more or less looking after him since his breakup with PJ Harvey. Kurt feels like absolute crap about the mere thought of even looking for heroin while he was in Seattle. Kurt does, however, at this time, call Courtney. He wants to speak to his daughter. Frances picks up the phone immediately. She knew it was Kurt, and nobody has heard from him all month. She's very worried about her father, but doesn't necessarily take his side. She thinks him not calling Courtney back was selfish, and the fact that he made everyone wait weeks to hear from him. Frances tells Kurt she loves him, and that he needs to get along with Courtney if they want to have a stable relationship as a family. Frances said she's been having a good time spending time with her mother, after the long absence they had away from each other. Kurt feels as if his own daughter is blaming him for all the problems between him and Courtney. But in his eyes, he feels it's all Courtney's fault. Kurt just wants to get away from all of it. He knew he was trying to get heroin from Mark for himself and not for a friend. He has the urge for that heroin fix he hasn't felt since the 90s. He doesn't feel good about it. At this time, he knows the only way for him to escape all the things bothering him and all his urges is to go away for a while. But he isn't sure where he could go to escape his mind. But he knows he has to figure out something soon, or he will end up down a path similar to what he went through in early 1994. October 2002. In early October, Kurt finally contacts Chris Novoselic and lets him know what's been going on. Chris isn't happy with Kurt and how he's neglected to contact any of his friends since the summer. Chris thought they had a good thing going with Nirvana playing small gigs and working on new material. Chris was also heavy into editing and mixing at the time too, and used Kurt's studio to hone his craft. But without Kurt around, he hasn't been doing much musically. Chris asked Kurt, quote unquote, "But what about the demos? Those are some of the best songs we've ever made." Kurt agrees and tells Chris not to worry, and that he will keep him in the loop with what's going on with Nirvana. Being back in Nirvana helped Kurt a lot after the breakup with PJ Harvey. But as time went on, he felt worse and worse. He can't sleep. He has dreams about her. He has dreams about doing drugs. So he elects to stay up to the very early hours of the morning until his body shuts down and forces him to sleep. It's not a healthy way of living. He tells Chris he might take a 2-week vacation away from everything to clear his mind. And when he returns, he promises to continue working on what they started. This eases Chris's mind. And he tells Kurt, quote unquote, "Yeah, maybe you should go on a little vacation somewhere. But where are you going to go?" Kurt responds with, "I'm not sure." Chris makes sure Kurt agrees to come back and finish the Nirvana EP, to which Kurt responds with a simple, "I will." The conversation ends there. Dave Grohl is about to release Foo Fighters' latest album, One by One, which Kurt shrugs off. He doesn't seem to care too much about what Dave's doing. He still hasn't even opened the emails he received from Dave with pre-recorded drum tracks. At this time, Kurt's life seems to be quietly falling apart, with him telling the people he's talked to that he's fine and he just needs some time to himself. He hasn't contacted Paul McCartney since the last time they spoke about purchasing the rights to Nirvana's music. Something about Paul rubs Kurt the wrong way. Kurt believes this to be Paul's need to inject himself into everything, and he feels like Paul never really cared about Kurt, but, quote, helped him out for his own benefit in the future. Kurt sees it as all a ruse, so he decides to not respond to any messages or missed calls from Paul at this time. The only thing on Kurt's mind right now, unfortunately, is drugs. He wants to go away for a while and get himself, quote unquote, fucked up to oblivion. But he knows that's not the right thing to do. He worked hard to get clean of heroin. He spent a lot of time tiptoeing around it. And it took a lot of effort and time to get clean. He still blames himself for not helping Lane Staley get clean. The simple, mere mention of heroin turned Kurt off of a conversation with his friend. To this day in 2002, he still thinks about the process he went through to get off of heroin. It was the hardest time of his life. And it's becoming evident now that he is still not over it. It is now creeping back into his head, like an old love that you lost and were never able to get back. That's how he feels. He misses PJ Harvey, but knows it's never going to get fixed. He feels like he caused it all, and he feels like a waste of air and space, much like how he felt in the beginning of 1994, which in our real timeline led to his untimely death. Kurt feels like a lost dog right now. He doesn't know where to go, but he knows he doesn't want to be at home. He doesn't even want to be in the United States. He hates it there. He definitely won't go back to Seattle. At this point, a part of him wants to go back to the UK. He loved it there. But where will he go? And what will he do? He can't just show up on PJ Harvey's doorstep and beg forgiveness. He already ousted Paul. He isn't sure what to do, but knows he needs to do something, and he needs to do something now. On October 20th, after sitting around and doing basically nothing in his home for the past few weeks, Kurt contacts Noel Gallagher of Oasis. The two were supposed to have a meetup in the summer to work on some music ideas, but that never ended up happening due to Kurt not being in the UK and being busy with Nirvana. Noel sets up a meeting with the two to meet sometime in mid-November to work on a song. Although in Kurt's mind, he has no intention on working on any kind of music. He just needed a reason to leave the United States and get away from what he views as a crumbling life. The saddest part of it all is he doesn't even mention to his daughter that he's going. He feels like she doesn't care and that she will inevitably take her mother's side anyway, even if that isn't the case at all. November 2002. In the beginning of the month, Kurt bites his lip and finally answers a call from Paul McCartney, who tells Kurt he has officially set up a meeting with Geffen to talk about purchasing the Nirvana catalog. Paul said he isn't upset that Kurt hasn't returned any of his calls, and knew if he gave him some time, he'd come back around again. Kurt tells Paul right now isn't a good time to discuss the Nirvana music rights, and he feels he's in a bad place and not mentally prepared for such a purchase. On a large scale such as Nirvana's massively successful music catalog. Kurt continues to shrug it off before telling Paul that he's not overly interested at the moment, and if Paul wants the songs, he should go get them. This baffles Paul completely, who has previously assumed him and Kurt were on the same page. But without Kurt talking to anyone, it's really hard to tell what Kurt's thinking. And clearly, he's been doing some thinking on his own. So it's hard to gauge where he's at mentally. Paul realizes this and tells Kurt he's going to give him some time to think about it before he makes a decision. Kurt abruptly hangs up the phone and immediately rolls a joint and power smokes it, as if the stress has fully taken over. He can't stop thinking about PJ Harvey, and he can't stop thinking about his daughter. And he cannot stop thinking about heroin. At this point in Kurt's life, he feels like his daughter might be better off without him. He feels that even his 10-year-old daughter is old enough now to realize Kurt's bullshit, and she's tired of it too. Or maybe she spent too much time with Courtney, and Courtney has been putting things into her head against Kurt. At this point in November of 2002, Kurt's life begins a massive downward spiral that could completely shape his future depending on how he handles the situation. He begins thinking about heroin once again, but knows if he goes down that road again, it's over, and all for nothing. On November 13th, 2002, Kurt books a flight to the UK to meet with Noel Gallagher of Oasis. He books a cheap motel and arranges transportation around town upon his arrival. When he arrives, Kurt does the unthinkable. He immediately gets a ride to PJ Harvey's house, where he knocks on the door. She's not home at the moment, and it's the middle of the night. Kurt just sits on the doorstep in the dark and smokes half a pack of cigarettes, in hopes that maybe she'll open the door. It's mid-November of 2002, and the weather conditions in the winter of 2002 were absolutely horrible. With whiteout snowfalls and numerous blizzards. It's cold and damp, and the first snowfall of the year starts while he's sitting on the doorstep. Eventually he gives up and calls another taxi. This time to the motel. But he didn't go unnoticed. PJ Harvey has a house sitter at the moment who would not answer the door for strangers, but would later tell Harvey they saw a strange man sitting on the doorstep for half an hour smoking cigarettes. Based on the description of the man, Harvey knew exactly who it was. The next day, Kurt finally fulfills his obligations and meets up with Noel Gallagher. It's during this meeting that Kurt tells Noel he has no intentions on ever going back to the United States. To which Noel asks, "What about your daughter?" Kurt would say, "I have to call her and let her know what's going on." Noel asked Kurt, "What about the band?" To which Kurt responded, "What band?" Noel would explain, "I heard you guys were back together doing little local tour thing. I was so excited to see Nirvana back." Kurt would explain to Noel that it was just a fun summer and he needed something to do rather than get blasted on heroin. Again with heroin being mentioned. Noel would tell Kurt he should call his daughter ASAP, and that they should go downstairs and work on a song. He then realized Kurt didn't even bring a guitar with him. It's very clear to Noel something is wrong with this guy, and he's not telling him everything. Kurt spends the night at Noel's place but stays awake until the very early morning of the next day. Due to the time difference, Kurt stayed up all night thinking about what to tell his daughter. He finally calls her before he goes to sleep. Courtney answers and Kurt requested to talk to Frances. Before handing the phone over to their daughter, Courtney explains to Kurt how upset she is that he neglects to contact much of his friends and family, and that for the most part, nobody knows what he's doing or where he is. Kurt responds with, quote unquote, "It's nobody's business. Now let me speak to my daughter." Once Frances picks up the phone, Kurt finally explains what's been going on, and he mentions how he feels like he needs to go on a vacation somewhere, away from everything. He does, however, invite Frances along with him, to which Frances responded with, quote unquote, "Dad, you know I can't. You know how Mom will react if we just disappear for a little while. I have to stay here, back at home." She explains to her father that she definitely understands what he's going through and tells him to go through with his plans to take a vacation and have a small getaway to help with his mental health. Kurt, in his mind, knowing he just wants to get away from anywhere he knows he's capable of getting heroin, he just isn't sure where yet. Frances asks Kurt to come home first and see her before he plans on going anywhere for any extended period of time, to which Kurt promises he will, and that he will keep in touch with her to let her know what's going on, no matter what. The conversation ends and Kurt hangs up the phone and goes to sleep. December 2002. About a week has gone by since Kurt last spoke to his daughter. At this time, he's still in the UK, staying at motels where he can. Thanks to a few mutual friends of Kurt and PJ Harvey, PJ Harvey catches wind of where Kurt has been staying. She heard he was sitting on her doorstep a few weeks ago from her house sitter at the time, and she decides it's time to confront him. She meets him in the motel lobby where he's been staying. Luckily for her, he was on his way out the door as she was arriving. Upon seeing Kurt, she gently tells him, "Let's go talk." Kurt isn't sure what to make of this, as he was not expecting to see her at all before going home. They make their way to the plaza just outside. It's snowing heavily, with a bad winter storm seemingly on the horizon. They take cover in a small bus shelter and have a short conversation. In this conversation, PJ tells Kurt that he can't be there. He has to go home. She also tells him that there's nothing he can do to fix the relationship and that she's already moved on. Kurt knew it in his heart already, but hearing it from her mouth absolutely crushes him. Although he maintains his composure and pretends like it didn't affect him hearing the news. But it's very clear that it affects him deeply. More so than anything else in his life. He was hanging on to a hope that maybe one day they could reconnect and work it out. But it's evident it doesn't seem like that's going to happen. Kurt Cobain and PJ Harvey are officially over on this day in December 2002. Kurt tells Harvey he's going away for a while, and he doesn't elaborate. She asks where he will go. He responds with, "I don't know." But it's evident now that Kurt just wants to crawl into a hole and die. He doesn't care anymore. This was the final straw in this episode of depression. Kurt abruptly gets up and walks away, leaving Harvey in the snowy bus shelter alone. The last thing she sees of Kurt is him walking away into the snowy fog, disappearing from her sight. It's over. On December 14th, 2002, Kurt books a flight back to LA, presumably to see his daughter and gather up some things before he goes off and takes this much-needed vacation away from everything he's been talking about. He was planning on contacting everyone of importance to him when he gets back home to let them know the situation. These people would include Chris, Dave, Courtney, and Francis. Kurt also tried to contact his Uncle Gary, to no avail. Kurt's flight is canceled due to the impending snowfall and inevitably delayed into the following week, based on the weather conditions. He didn't want to wait around in an airport or spend a bunch more money on hotels. So he contacts the last person he talked to, Noel Gallagher, to see if he can crash on his couch for the night until he figures out a new mode of transportation. Noel invites him over. Later that night, in the very early morning hours of the day, Kurt arrives at Noel's. During his stay, Noel mentions to Kurt that he owns a dual-engine, 6-seat private plane that can take Kurt anywhere he needs to go. Noel explains that his pilot is ready and able to fly at a moment's notice, and that he can give him a call anytime to see if they can get Kurt where he needs to go. Kurt doesn't mind the idea. He's never taken a private plane before, so the idea is intriguing to him. Noel does warn Kurt that weather conditions aren't going to let up for the next week, stating that it's probably not a bad idea to stay in town until the weather clears up a bit. Kurt doesn't want to wait around. He wants to get the ball rolling as soon as possible and tells Noel to give the pilot a call. Noel continuously tried to talk Kurt out of going anywhere with the weather conditions, but Noel be later stated as saying, the dude was completely out of his mind. It's explained to Kurt that he more than likely can't go back overseas in the small 2-engine plane without doing 3 or 4 layovers before reaching his destination, especially with the weather. It's clear that it'll be a long flight with lots of stops for refueling to make it back to his home in the United States. The plan then changes for Kurt to take the plane to a more remote location where the weather conditions aren't as bad, where he can take a flight. Kurt doesn't care. He just really wants out of the UK. He felt like PJ Harvey officially kicked him out of the country, and without her in his life, he doesn't care about being there as much as he did before. Noel contacts the pilot of his private plane, and a plan is made for Kurt to meet at the tarmac the following day. The snow continues to get worse. On December 15th, 2002, just 10 days before Christmas, Kurt arrives and boards the private plane. Before he left Noel's, Noel continued to try to convince Kurt to not go in these weather conditions. But Kurt just didn't listen. It's almost like he wasn't there. He just wanted to get the hell out of the country. The pilot asks Kurt where he's headed and gives him a rundown of how the flight will be and how many times they need to stop to refuel. Kurt offers to pay all the expenses with his credit card, which he calls, quote-unquote, record label money. The snow is relentless, almost not visible. But the pilot assures Kurt he's seen worse, and he's done this a number of times in the past. The plane takes off, and Kurt is on his way out of the UK. He didn't contact anyone before he left, including his daughter, who has no idea he's on his way home. 3 days go by and Kurt hasn't been seen at his house or anywhere in town. He hasn't contacted anybody, including Noel Gallagher. It's clear Kurt didn't go home. Nobody knows where he went, but it's obvious he used the private plane to get somewhere nobody would know where he is. Or maybe something happened during the flight that nobody knows about. The only person that would know Kurt arrived safely is Noel, as the private plane was his, and he would know if anything happened during the flight, especially 3 days after the fact. Kurt is nowhere to be found. He hasn't talked to his friends or family, and hasn't appeared anywhere publicly since he left on the plane 3 days ago. Where could Kurt have gone? In what mental state could he be in? And the real question is, when will Kurt go home or even contact his daughter? Does he plan to do that at all? Was there an issue with the flight? Did Kurt arrive safely? These are all questions on everybody's mind. This will conclude If Kurt Cobain Lived, 2002. We hope you enjoyed listening, and please stay tuned for If Kurt Cobain Lived, 2003. Let us know in the comments where you think Kurt is, or where he may have went. See you next time.